The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
This very eloquent and emotional description of Yahweh by Richard Dawkins was met with cheers of "hear, hear" by the atheist community when it was released. But is what Richard Dawkins is saying true? Is God really an ethnic cleanser and a genocidal maniac? Well, in this video, I'm going to unpack why that is not the case by looking at the words devoted to destruction, the Hebrew word herem, in context and usage. When I still believed in fairy tales about an all-powerful, guiding yet impersonal force called evolution, which somehow was the origin of the stars and the planets, I too thought that God was a little bit naughty. In fact, I thought he was guilty of mass murder and maybe even genocide. But after carefully reading the text, combined with Bible study, it became clear that these calls for devote to destruction or to be utterly destroyed did not actually mean literally that the Canaanite groups of people were slaughtered or annihilated. Before we start to analyze some of the Bible verses which show this, we need to understand that God is the creator and sustainer of the entire universe and everything in it. Therefore, God has every right to allot certain pieces of land to certain people groups whenever he wants to. In addition, God has every right to judge evil nations for the wicked acts they've done. Even the nation of Israel, his prized possession or the apple of his eye. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 18 to see this use of herem, which means to be devoted to destruction. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Notice that it says that nothing that breathes shall be left alive, and that they shall be utterly destroyed. If this was literally the case, and if this was what literally happened, then we would expect for these people groups not to be mentioned again after they'd been destroyed. But the problem is, they're often mentioned many times after they've been wiped out or destroyed. I think it's important to note here that God specifically pointed out certain people groups, not all, just certain people groups that were particularly evil and that need to be punished. Namely all the ites I just mentioned before. For whatever reason, these cultures, these people groups were particularly wicked, and we know that they had done such acts like gross sexual immorality, incest, bestiality, rape, and horrific child sacrifice. I think if a country existed today with such cultures, I think there would be very, very similar outrage. As mentioned, God has every right to give certain land to certain people groups. In Genesis 15, verses 13 to 16, we read, "Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." Here we learn that God promises Abraham that his descendants will have their own promised land. But Abraham, or Abraham as it's later renamed, would not see it. In fact, it would be over 400 years before his descendants, later the nation of Israel, would be brought out of bondage from Egypt, and they would be given the land to live in. But there is also a reason why God delayed for 400 years, because the sin of the Amorites was not yet complete. Now, this actually shows God's compassion and patience for people who are committing sin. Think about it. That's over 400 years. What kind of person today is that patient? We want things to be done the next day or the next week. Even a year is often too long. But from God's perspective, he gives them 400 years to repent. So that's a lot of time. That's ample time for a nation, if they wanted to repent and turn away from their evil deeds. But they didn't. So 400 years, I think you can imagine how, I presume, gradually over time, things started getting more evil and more evil and more evil, until it got to a point that was past the point of no return, where God had to judge them for their wicked. So God killed two birds with one stone here. First, he punished these nations, and secondly, he gave the land that they had misused to his people, the Israelites, who he brought out of bondage from Egypt. Clearly, when God brought his people into the land, he didn't want his people to start copying the kind of things that the Amorites and the Canaanites did that brought about judgment. The conquest of the promised land started with Joshua, who promised to do all that the Lord had commanded. In Joshua 11:21 we read, "And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain." So in this verse we learn that Joshua killed all of the Amorites living in Hebron and Debir. But if that's what literally happened, then why do we see just a few chapters later, guess who? The Amorites living in, guess where? Hebron and Debir. Joshua 15:13-15 says, "According to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, a portion among the people of Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak. And Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. And he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir." There's something else going on behind the text here, which should make us realize that this devote to destruction or be wiped out does not literally mean wiping out, but something else. In fact, in Joshua 10 verses 20 and 21, we learn, "When Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities, then all the people returned safe to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah." Here we have, in one sentence, the Amorites supposedly being wiped out or utterly destroyed or devoted to destruction. And yet in the next clause, the remnant of these people who'd been wiped out went into the fortified cities. This should make us think, what's going on? How can a nation that's been wiped out or destroyed still have remnants if it's literally talking about the total killing of that people group? Doesn't make sense. So how should we understand herem? Well, the main thrust and usage of herem in the Old Testament is actually not about the total killings or mass slaughtering. It's referring to the driving out of the nations from a certain area. In a sense, dispossessing the people. This is the punishment that these nations were to face, to be driven out of the land, but also that God would give his people, Israel, this land as an everlasting covenant. To further strengthen the idea that it's not about literal slaughtering, we need to compare the biblical text to other texts that describe wars and battles from the ancient Near East around a similar time frame. Let's look at three examples. First, the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmosis III in around 1500 BC said, "The numerous army of Mitanni was overthrown within the hour, annihilated totally, like those now not existent." However, we know historically that the Mitanni existed for at least 200 years after this so-called annihilation. The second example is the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah in around 1230 BC who wrote, "Israel is wasted. His seed is no more." Clearly, Israel's still alive and well many, many years later. The third example is from the Moabite king Mesha, who wrote around 840 BC that the northern kingdom of Israel no longer ceased to exist. They'd been wiped out. Yet we know that this isn't true. Clearly, the purpose behind this language, this ancient war rhetoric, is just exaggerated language to show that there was a win, not total killing of both sides. And in fact, we use similar language today when we're talking about sports. Now, I'm from England, and my favourite football team is Liverpool. And last season, Liverpool beat Manchester United 7-0. 7-0. That's quite a big, comprehensive defeat. So when I said to my friend, "Oh, I can't believe Liverpool thrashed Manchester United 9-0, that's fine. To thrash means to comprehensively beat. But if I say that they slaughtered them, they annihilated them, everybody knows that I'm not talking about the literal killing. And it was the same when people read these accounts. They were very familiar. It was a familiar literary device that it's not literally talking about the annihilation, because even within the text, it tells us that there are people groups who were wiped out, who were utterly destroyed, and yet they're still alive and well several chapters, or even in other books. So from Joshua into Judges, into 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and Chronicles, people groups that had been wiped out were still there. To conclude, God had every right to punish the Canaanite groups living in that area at that time. Now, this is not to say that there was not loss of life. Clearly there was. There were battles fought, lives were lost, but the purpose was to drive out these wicked nations from the area in the hope that they would not, I guess you could say, spiritually poison the Israelites. However, even though God told them to destroy them, to push them out, actually that's not what fully happened. And that's why we read throughout Judges and the rest of the Old Testament that these negatively influencing nations did actually do what God didn't want them to do. So there's really some culpability of the nation of Israel for not fully following God's command. It's also worth pointing out that these battles had to be initiated by God. If God said, "Go and attack them," or if they asked God, "Should we go?" and God replied, "Yes," then they won the battle. However, there are many times recorded in the Old Testament, in Joshua and Judges and in various times, when the Israelites themselves took it upon themselves to go and fight. That is when they lost. So the context is that it's God who gave the land to them, and it's God who had to approve or direct the attacks against the people groups. Because if they did attack without God's approval or consent, then they would be defeated. So no, the Hebrew word herem, or to devote to destruction or to utterly destroy, is not in any way talking about genocidal tendencies. It is used to drive out people, in this case the Canaanite groups, because of their sin, because of their wickedness, their child sacrifice, their horrific culture. And God did not want them, his people Israel, to be influenced by them, although sadly they ultimately were. Well, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe to the channel, comment on the video, share the video, and like the video. And remember, faith is not fairy tales, and God is real.